So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Birding with Extension Cup Chat. Maureen will not be joining us for a little bit. She is out on maternity leave, so congrats to Maureen. She's had the newest member of the Birding with Extension team. They just may not know it yet. And so joining me today is Christy Esmahan. She is a avid Texas birder out of Austin, Texas. And we're going to be talking about Project Feederwatch today. For those of you who don't know what Project Feeder is, Christy is here to tell us a little bit about it and kind of talk a little bit. And she has a really cool story about how she met Maureen. And so I'm going to let Christy kind of introduce herself, give a little bit of a background. And I think we've got to hear the story about how you ended up on Cup Chat.
So good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here and part of Cup Chat. I like to joke that I became a birder, stepped from bird watching to birding when I became an empty nester. So it's kind of funny, really cool to be on the opposite end of where Maureen is, just starting her family. When our last child graduated from college is when my husband and I finally got enough time to be able to really get into birding. But the way I met Maureen was really interesting because I had gotten a email on Tuesday morning, the 12th from Feederwatch. My interactions with Feederwatch for the last 8 or 9 years had only been through the computer. And suddenly I get an email from a real person and they say there is this professor in at A&M, at the University of A&M, and she is doing a talk called Cup Chat, and she would like to talk to somebody who's been a volunteer with Feederwatch in Texas for a long time. Are you interested? And if you are, reach out to her. Here's her contact information. And I said, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So I sent her an email, dear Dr. Frank, and introduced myself. I'm on Travis Audubon Board of Trustees, and I lead the advocacy committee, and I'm super excited about birds. And I've been, a bird watcher for a long time and a feeder watcher. And she writes back and she says, Christy, I just took your class last night. I had given a Spanish for birders class through my local Audubon, and she had been one of my students. And she says, I wrote one of the key words on my notebook when I came into work this morning because I'm going to try to learn every week a little bit more of Spanish for birding. So it was a cool start.
And it's just such a small world. So I love that. So, Christy, let's kind of talk about, you talked a little bit about your history with Feederwatch, and you've been a volunteer for about 8 years. For those who don't know what Feederwatch is, can you give us a little bit of a background of what Feederwatch is and how people might be able to participate if that's something they're interested in?
Yeah, it's a wonderful project. It's citizen science. It was started in Canada in the 1970s in Ontario, Canada. And it was a small group, and I'm blanking on their name, Long Observatory, I think it was. And they got about 500 participants who would watch their backyards with or without feeders. And I know that's one of the questions we'll have later on. And they would write down all the birds that they had and email them in. As Feederwatch got more, as it developed more, they decided it would give the scientists a better overview of what birds were where if the United States participated. So they reached out to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the premier birding institution in the United States, and Cornell started Feederwatch. And I joined Feederwatch, I think in 2012, 2013, around there. I still had kids. So I was birding, while I had my morning cup of coffee, packing lunches or whatever. And I'd look out and say, oh, 3 house sparrows. Okay. It wasn't a super detailed thing. But Cornell is the first one who told me about Feederwatch and said, oh, you should join. It's from November to April. It's really open. You can participate as often as you want or not very often at all. And there are some years that maybe I only put in 2 or 3 entries if I got really busy. And it was just a great opportunity. Since I am a scientist by training, it appealed to me to do citizen science. But a lot of people that I know are not scientists, and it's a really fun thing to do, to just watch. It's a good way to sharpen your birding skills. When you first sign up, They send you a poster of all the local birds that you're likely to see in your backyard, and it helps you identify. So when I first signed up, I thought all I had were house sparrows and blue jays and maybe the odd cardinal. And it was through watching the feeders a little more carefully that I started noticing, oh, wait a second, that isn't a house sparrow, that's a house finch, you know, and oh my gosh, that one's completely different. Let me look up and see what kind of bird that could be. And, you know, yeah, I didn't even own binoculars when I first started, and now I usually have binoculars with me, no matter where I am.
Well, that's funny. I used to not bird with binoculars because I do have good vision. I know we've talked about that a little bit on Cup Chat before. But now I am starting to utilize more binoculars. But it's a funny, interesting thing that you say that Feederwatch really kind of honed your birding skills. Because as a beginner birder, when we went out to the Davis Mountains and we were at, we luckily took a photography course with Lee Hoy. What really helped me be a better birder was to repetitively see the same bird. And that's what, to me, when you talk about Feederwatch and helping you learn to identify, especially your local species, it would help register. So like a woodhouse scrubjay, I would see him every like 20 minutes at Lee Hoy's house. He would just come get a peanut and go off. Or seeing, it was during the hummingbirds, and so we saw hundreds and hundreds of hummingbirds. And so I can see how that really repetitive of seeing the same birds and Cornell sending you a poster of what, hey, this is what you're supposed to see, could really sharpen a beginner birder skill to know their local birds very well. Yeah. So what's the difference though of doing Project Feederwatch versus just doing Feederwatch, but just putting it into eBird? Why are there two different categories?
So Feederwatch is a specific sub area within eBird, and they have data scientists that they hire specifically to analyze Feederwatch data. eBird participation is free. And Feederwatch, they do have a small fee that they charge each year to pay those scientists and to pay for the rollout of new programs to help you enter the data. So for example, this year they came up with a really cool little Project Feederwatch app. So you no longer have to write your entries down. There are also a different set of rules for Feederwatch than for eBird. So I keep an eBird list of birds in my backyard, and with eBird, you're allowed to count birds that are flying over. Or if I had a backyard that had, for example, a lake, which I don't, the ducks and geese that came there, I would be able to count them. On Project Feederwatch, the rules are more stringent, and you're not allowed to count flyovers. You're not allowed to count birds at the lake that aren't specifically coming to your feeder or within a certain area. Feederwatch also asks you to document your area as to the number and size and type of trees that you have. And they make it really easy. How many trees do you have that are over 10 feet tall, that are deciduous, that are, you know, evergreen? And then they also ask you about the activity, human activity and animal activity in your backyard or in that area. You know, is there a dog or a cat that spends more than 30 minutes in your backyard, or people activity more than 3 times a week? Things like that. And that helps them get a much more thorough understanding of this little patch of land and what's going on with the birds there. And since Feederwatch is only November to April, that also helps them get a much more thorough understanding of what's going on when it's not breeding season.
Absolutely. And so that's a great, you know, a great point, that they're trying to get a picture of what your backyard looks like and the environment those birds are coming in, and that tells them so much more than that you just saw a house sparrow in Houston. Right. So now, curious on that note, when you are part of Project Feederwatch and you're putting in all that information, do they record what types of feeders, what type of seed you're putting out in your backyard?
Yes, so that's the other thing. They ask you, so how many seed feeders do you have? Do you have hoppers? Do you have suet? Do you scatter seed on the ground? Do you put up a water source? How many? And then they also ask you, they used to ask you very thoroughly about the weather. And now since that's available, they only ask you if there's an accumulation of ice or snow on the ground, or if there is, if it's flooded. I mean, here, obviously, although we did have some rain, some snow in Austin.
Yeah, not really a problem here in Texas.
Yeah.
We did have snow in Del Rio, guys. I think I posted a picture, which that's just like a once in an every 15-year kind of thing here. But we actually had some snow, and it was so pretty. But let's talking about feeders. The website has tons of great resources, everybody. So we will post the link in the comments to go to the Feederwatch website for you to check it out if you have any questions. But let's talk a little bit about feeders, Christy. And I love a good feeders, and talking about we talked about me having a livestock background, supplemental feeding. We're doing that. We're doing Feederwatch in a time of year, winter or migration season-ish, where these birds' nutritional requirements are much higher than when it's nice and pretty outside. So let's talk a little bit about maybe your experience with feeders. What's your favorite feeder? I always like to make people pick. So if you had to pick one feeder in your backyard that you told people in Texas that they should really try in their backyard, what is it?
So I would say it's a suet feeder with hot pepper seed food, because mammals hate it. So you won't have to fight the squirrels. You don't have to worry about rodents or raccoons or anybody else being interested in the bird seed. And it brings in pretty much, other than hummingbirds, every single bird loves the suet. But I have suet seed and hummingbird feeders because I just love the birds so much, and I love seeing the variety.
Gotcha. So I guess this is just a weird random question. You live in a fairly urban area, or you live out in the country a little bit?
It's what they call urban suburban. It's kind of, we're up on the side of a mountain, so we're technically still Austin, and I can see the downtown skyline, but I'm surrounded by preserve. So I get a lot of interesting birds. I even had the golden cheek warbler in my backyard.
Ooh, so that's wonderful.
10 feet away from my window.
Well, that's not going to help me lure you to come to Birding the Border. That's one of our favorite.
Oh no, the border is amazing. I love the border. So.
Yes. Well, so that's interesting. I particularly think so. It's one of those great feeding options. When we were at the Rio Grande Birding Festival, when we went to Benson State Park, all the suet that they feed and all the green jays that come in just is overwhelming. But here, and a lot of times, if we're not, which for Project Feederwatch, it would not worry, but in the summer, it just gets a little hot to do true suet. And they do have the high temperature suet now that we've been buying here.
So this chili pepper suet also is high temperature, and I have it out when it's 105, 110 degrees. It does not melt away. You do need to make sure and this is with all feeders, that you are throwing away the seed and cleaning your feeders every so often. So for example, for hummingbird feeders in the summer when it's 100 degrees every day, I'm changing them and cleaning them every single day. When the weather gets colder, you can space it out 3 or 4 days. But you do have to be responsible if you're feeding the birds, because, if you think about it, you're creating a false situation. In nature, birds would not all congregate in one space to eat. And when we are bringing them in together for our enjoyment and to help them, we also can set up a situation for potential infections. So you do have to be responsible with cleaning your feeders and also maintaining them as a safe distance from the windows, which is within 3 feet, so that if a predator should show up, when they scatter, they don't run into your windows, fly into your windows.
So true. We talk about the M&M bowl. Like if I were to eat an M&M bowl, which we would not ever do now in COVID, but if I had a bowl of M&Ms and I took my mouth and I ate some and then I passed it over to you, that's a very easy way to transmit diseases. And that's the same thing we're doing when we're setting up our supplemental feeding station. So you talked about predators. And I was reading on the website, and I didn't put this in the question, so I'm throwing a curveball to you.
Okay.
But I thought that was interesting. So even in Feederwatch, y'all can record predation?
Absolutely, and they encourage you. And if the predators are other birds, hawks or something, you're basically feeding the birds too. So the interesting predators I've had are Cooper's hawks. I see red-tailed hawks flying over, and I had a roadrunner come up and spend quite a bit of time on my patio. I think he was scouting for hummingbirds, which they will pick off, but I never saw him catch one, which I'm okay with too. But the predators are gorgeous birds too, and it's interesting. And I'm lucky that I really don't have other predators around here. In my neighborhood, there are coyotes, which have taken, fortunately, care of any cat problems. Because cats, as you know, are an invasive species, man-made, and probably the biggest outdoor cats are the biggest human damage that we do to birds and to small mammals and reptiles across the country.
Yes, absolutely. And that's funny. We actually have, there's lots, so my office, for some reason, my office is kind of in the middle of Del Rio, but we have lots of trees, and it's really kind of a little perfect oasis in the middle of a kind of a little subdivision. And so we've had a hawk that's been living at the office, and randomly you'll go out and see pigeon feathers scattered everywhere. And so that's it's just been fun to kind of see that. Now, we talk a lot about native plants being a great resource for our birds. What if someone did not want to do supplemental feeders but wanted to plant a very specific native plant garden that would support bird activity? Now, that winter, growing native plants in the winter, for me, growing native anything or plants any time of year is a challenge. But for more of our green thumbs out there who are skillful, what can you just do a native plant garden and participate?
Absolutely. Having a feeder is not a requirement for Feederwatch. If your land isn't covered with snow or ice, then even dead plants will continue to provide seeds, will continue to provide leaf litter, which hides insects underneath. So for example, my yard is planted with native plants. And even though it looks all brown, the robins are going through now, and they have been industrious and so busy and scattered 2 feet apart, covering the entire yard as they pick through the leaf litter and try to find the insects and the seeds below. Insects mostly, they're robins, but I have other birds that are seed eaters that are finding those underneath. So definitely native plants helps. If you do have snow and ice and you don't want to put out feeders, then putting out water is really helpful for birds, especially in the snow and ice, but all year long, because they often don't have a clean source of drinking water and fresh water to bathe in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what happens? So sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Because Maureen, and you can always go back and check out, we have several videos online for those who are watching. We have a video about messy gardens and planting native plants to making sure that your backyard is bird friendly. We have the series called Feeders, and we talked about a different feeder each time. So if you have some questions about feeders, there's plenty of information to go back out and watch. And those should all be saved on our Facebook page. Now, what happens with all the data collected for Feederwatch? What is some of the interesting data that's come out that people should understand that this is really going for a cause? Participating is really going to a cause and finding us some more information about some of our more desired species.
So when you go out birding, and this is something you were talking about, when you're regularly out birding, a lot of people are looking for rare birds or strange birds. And so we don't have a lot of data, or we didn't before Feederwatch, about what are the regular birds. Now there's a growing number of birders who will record every single bird that they see, and that is an ideal thing to do on eBird. But with Project Feederwatch, we get a really close-up view of what the regular birds are and their numbers. And one of the things they've been able to see through Feederwatch is that over the years, the number of common birds, and we're talking even invasives or introduced birds like starlings and house sparrows, but also common birds that are not non-native, so like grackles or blue jays, have gone down. And it's really interesting. So a huge report was published in the magazine Science, the journal Science, which showed that the United States and North America had lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, which is 1 out of every 4 birds has disappeared. And through projects like Project Feederwatch, we've been able to even more specifically see what kind of birds are being affected. And we can also see, for example, if there is a lot of stressors. So for example, people are using a lot of pesticides on their farms or in their yards, or there's a lot of free roaming cats, or, you know, the buildings, whatever, aren't protected, and there's a lot of bird strikes. And so they've been able to see where birds are going instead. And they've gotten some really interesting data on what birds are doing to survive. So there were birds, for example, who used to never show up at feeders, who now are showing up at feeders haggard and hungry and thirsty. And so that's been interesting to watch as well.
Absolutely. And I think the neat thing to me would be, as participants participate all over the country, you can really see, because y'all do it, the ideal thing is every 5 days you do 2 count days. And
right.
So that's ideal, you know, as eBird kind of tracks migration very quickly or fast if people are birding very sporadically, but that's a much more consistent set of data. And so you really can pinpoint, okay, Christy's in Austin and Emily's in Del Rio. And so they left Del Rio area and they showed up at Christy's. And so you can really track that migration just a little bit more specific for our migrating species, as well as our regular normal birds that stay all year long. So that's super neat.
Yeah, the other thing is with Project Feederwatch, you're tracking all birds that show up all day. So if you keep a list, for 10 minutes or an hour, you know, an eBird list, or 2 hours. But with Feederwatch, you're making the little checks and now putting it in the in your smartphone the whole day. So for example, I've had where, for example, an Eastern Phoebe will show up in my backyard at 4 o'clock and it'll be the only bird. I may not have recorded that in my eBird list that I did at breakfast, but it'll go down in the Project Feederwatch list because it showed up, or I hear a great horned owl calling at night. That'll also go onto the Project Feederwatch list that maybe I wouldn't have done an eBird list for that one bird.
Right, absolutely. And so being in Austin, I have to ask you a crazy question now. We're going to go completely off script like we normally do. So I've been seeing on Facebook all the cedar waxwings. Did you get a bunch of cedar waxwings through your yard?
Yeah. So the cedar waxwings are winter birds for us. But with all the robins here, I think the cedar waxwings, I felt like they had to elbow out. And so they were so close to my window as they were competing with the robins for the ash juniper berries that, you know, even though I'm a terrible photographer, I was able to just sit there and, you know, take hundreds of pictures right from my bedroom window. And I got some really fun shots of cedar waxwings. They're just such beautiful birds. So
gorgeous. And I have seen some in previous years, but this year, everyone Facebook pictures. So shout out to everybody on Facebook posting your cedar waxwing photos. I have just adored those and have had so much fun seeing them. They've just been beautiful pictures. So since you were over far enough that way, I thought I could say, hey, have you seen all of them? They've just been gorgeous this year. And let's kind of keep rolling. What's your favorite birding spot in Texas for those? And maybe since we are hosting Birding the Border in April in Del Rio, we might have some people traveling 35 through Austin. So maybe give your favorite local birding spot, your favorite birding spot in Texas, and maybe what your spark bird was.
Oh gosh, so that's a lot of different questions. So let me start in reverse order. Spark bird, I'm trying to think. It was either the killdeer. It was probably the killdeer because I grew up in Ohio, in Cincinnati, and a killdeer struck me as a shorebird, reminded me of the ocean. And I was like, what the heck is a little shorebird doing calling out in the middle of the field? And so I was really excited about them. The first bird that I collect pelicans, not live ones, obviously, or dead ones, but little, pictures of pelicans and statues and whatever. And I started doing that when I was 18. And so I have hundreds of those that I've purchased throughout the world, and love having those. As far as birding in Austin, Austin has some fantastic places to bird. Hornsby Bend, which is the water treatment facility, they have seen, I think, 360, 370 species of birds there. So it's an amazing place. Commons Ford is another really great place where it was like a normal park with just trash grasses and no birds 12 or 13 years ago. And some really interested birders got together and volunteered to replant and put in native grasses and do burns and controlled burns and really take care of the land. And they ended up creating this paradise where now we've seen over 250 species of birds. So it's amazing in 10 years, the progress. But there's a ton of different parks and areas to bird in, and we just take turns, and every weekend my husband and I go birding somewhere around the Austin area. We don't go too far because of COVID, but it's really wonderful to get out and bird in this area. What were your other questions?
My last one was, where's your favorite place, or where's the favorite place you've ever been birding?
Like my favorite place ever?
Ever. Where's your top birding spot that you've ever been?
Oh my gosh. So we went to the Yucatan a couple years ago, and we found an ornithological reserve, just saw the sign off the side of the road. And it's just north of Playa, it's between Cancun and Playa del Carmen. And that was spectacular. We got 80 different birds that day. We were at 79 from going to the reserve and just going around. And then it was evening, the sun was setting. My husband decided to go swim in the pool, and he was the only person. And the pool was in the middle of like the jungle. And all of a sudden we look up, and this big, huge bird comes flying over and lands on the roof. It was an osprey. And I think it had heard the splashing and said, "What, fish?" It was my husband. So it stayed for a little bit. I was like, number 80. Didn't even need binoculars for the osprey. And then it flew off. So that was it. For us, it's a record to see 80 bird species in one day. And that was it. But I also love the Rio Grande Valley. We went down there for a 4-day weekend and got 120 species that weekend. And it was amazing. So
that was one of my favorite birding trips, probably, was when we went to the Rio Grande Valley. The one thing, though, that when we went to, I did Benson State Park, and just seeing so many of the same species was just overwhelming to me. Like Kakalaka's by the hundreds, green jays by the hundreds, and and it's really neat, I think, to see one or two as you bird. But that was just so many at one time. The same species was crazy. So I had the Rio Grande Valley was definitely a fun trip for us. That was our first Birding with the Extension Bird Festival that we went to, and that was fun. Something different to do, Maureen and I, before she's abandoned me and gone on maternity leave. So I guess I'll forgive her.
So the fun thing to do is, before you go to a place where there are new bird species that you don't know, is to make yourself little quiz to learn the birds as much as possible. So I had the opportunity a couple years ago to go birding in Thailand. My husband was doing a project and I tagged along. And so for the couple months before that, using Quizlet, the app, I had made myself a bunch of 120, 130 birds. And it was so cool then to go and see the birds. And the birds, they're like movie stars, and they look just like their pictures. And it's like, oh my God. So it's really exciting. It's a great hobby to get into.
That is absolutely so true. It has been such a blessing to be a part of the birding community and learn about birds, even as a beginner birder, and working with Birding with Extension. So I love the idea of Project Feederwatch, and I think that that's such a great idea, especially for our beginner birders, to kind of hone their identification skills, especially of their local birds. So that's such a great practice tool. We talk a lot about it, our Learn to Bird program, about now it's time to go practice. And
Yes.
so Project Feederwatch, where those birds are coming in, you're seeing those same birds every day. You know what birds you're supposed to be seen. And then you only have the 1 or 2 rare birds that you could go and look up in your field guide. So
yeah, having them in your backyard, you also get to know the sounds. And then when a rare bird comes in, you're like, oh, I haven't heard that one before.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and if you plan it perfectly, you can maybe put even in inclement cold weather, which I am out on. I'm like a cat. I don't like to be cold or wet. And even in inclement weather, you could bird from inside, depending upon your feeder placement in your yard, if you have that ability. So anyways, but Christy, thank you so much for joining us today for Cup Chat. It was great to learn a little bit more about Feederwatch and meet a fellow Texan birder. If anyone has any questions about Project Feederwatch, definitely feel free to give us a chat. I have not been watching the chat today since Maureen is not with us, and I've been working all aspects. So if you've had questions about Feederwatch, type that in the comments. Let us know where you're joining us from. And if I don't have the answer, we will get Christy the answer to help us answer those questions about Project Feederwatch. And if anyone has any questions, don't forget we are 3 months away from kicking off Birding the Border 2021. We're so excited at the end of April, and we hope to see everyone there. If anyone has any questions, let us know. And thanks again, Christy, for joining us. And everyone, y'all have a wonderful Wednesday. Bye, guys.
Thank you.